In the late autumn of 1935, in a cattle pasture on the floodplain of the Arkansas River in LaFleur County, Oklahoma, 3 miles from the small town of Spiro, 6 men were working in a hand-dug tunnel driven into the side of an earthen mound. The mound was called Craig Mound, and it did not look like much from the outside. It was long and humped and grass-covered, shaped something like a caterpillar lying on its side, rising out of the bottomland where the river spreads wide and slow. The men were not archaeologists. They were miners, working under a commercial lease, digging for objects they could sell. And on that day, somewhere inside the western end of the mound, a shovel blade went through packed earth and met open air. They had broken into a room, not a collapsed grave, not a pit that had filled with silt over the centuries, a hollow cavity inside a dirt mound in the wet Oklahoma bottomland, a chamber that had never taken in soil. Inside it, cedar poles were still standing. There were textiles that had not rotted. There was basketry and feathers and wooden masks with eyes inlaid in shell and hundreds of engraved conch shell cups stacked together like dishes in a cupboard. Organic material of that kind should not survive 4 or 5 centuries in eastern Oklahoma. It should be a stain in the dirt. It was not a stain. It was intact, and if that chamber was sealed, deliberately packed, closed, and walked away from, then the standard story of what happened at Spiro is wrong in an important way. Spiro was not a city that faded out. It was a city that was shut down on purpose. Someone made that decision. Someone chose the moment. The men in that tunnel left no scientific record. The only reason the contents of that chamber can be reconstructed at all is that a man the archaeological establishment did not consider qualified spent years writing down what he saw. The digging outfit had a name. They called themselves the Pocola Mining Company, and in 1933 they leased the right to excavate Craig Mound from the landowner. Under Oklahoma law at the time, what they were doing was legal. The scientific work began only after they were finished. Between 1936 and 1941, the University of Oklahoma conducted Works Progress Administration excavations at Spiro under the direction of Forrest E. Clements, working through what the miners had left behind. The definitive modern reconstruction belongs to James A. Brown of Northwestern University, who spent more than 50 years on the problem. Brown pieced the site back together from WPA field notes, museum accession records, dealer correspondence, and scattered private collections, and published the results as the Spiro Ceremonial Center. It was Brown who gave the sealed chamber the name it now carries in the literature. He called it the Great Mortuary. Radiocarbon dating measures the decay of carbon-14 in once living material, and it is the standard method for placing organic remains in time. Applied to the cedar structure and associated organics from inside Craig Mound, it places the ceiling of the Great Mortuary in the first half of the 15th century, in the window around 1400 to 1450. That number by itself is unremarkable. It fits comfortably within the Mississippian period. Here is where it gets specific. The objects inside the chamber do not date to 1450. Engraved marine shell, hammered copper plates, and carved stone effigy pipes recovered from the deposit belong stylistically and contextually to the 1200s and the 1100s. Some of the material had been made 200 years before it was buried, some of it closer to 300. Standard practice treats a mound deposit as a snapshot of the moment it was constructed. What goes in the ground reflects the world of the people putting it there. Spiro is not a snapshot. It is a collection. The people who filled that chamber were handling objects that were older to them than the Declaration of Independence is to a person living today. To understand why that matters, it helps to know exactly what came out of the ground. The estimates run into the thousands of objects. Lightning whelk shell from the Gulf of Mexico, more than 700 miles to the south. Copper from the Great Lakes region, roughly 900 miles to the northeast. chert from quarries in Missouri and Illinois, wooden masks, cane matting, dyed and woven textiles, featherwork, the largest assemblage of pre-contact perishable material ever recovered anywhere in eastern North America. Under normal conditions, none of it should exist. The reason it exists is the void. Mounds fill in, timber roofs collapse, sediment works down through the fill, water moves through, and organics decay. The Great Mortuary did not fill in. Brown's reconstruction describes a floor of cedar poles laid over a prepared surface, loaded with offerings, and then covered over, and when the timber settled under the weight of the earth above it, it settled in a way that held the overburden out. What formed inside was a pocket of dry, still air. That pocket is the only reason there are 500-year-old feathers in a museum drawer in Oklahoma. 3 separate observations indicate this was a deliberate deposit rather than an accumulated cemetery. The first is arrangement. The material was sorted by category rather than scattered, which is not the pattern produced by burials added one at a time over generations. The second is sourcing. The raw materials come from 4 widely separated regions, hundreds of miles apart in different directions, which means the contents were gathered and curated rather than locally produced. The third is the age spread already described. A cemetery accumulates gradually. This was placed. The first mainstream reaction was outrage, and then it was avoidance. When the mining lease expired in November of 1935, the diggers are reported to have set off explosives in the mound. Oklahoma passed its first antiquities protection statute that same year. It was too late for Craig Mound. For decades afterward, professional archaeology treated Spiro as a compromised site provenience destroyed, context unrecoverable, and therefore not a foundation you could build an argument on. But that's only part of it. The argument about why Spiro ended does not actually depend on the inside of the mound. It depends on the river valley around it. And the valley was empty. Beginning in the 1980s, archaeologists working across the mid-continent began describing a pattern that had been sitting in the regional data without a name. It is now called the Vacant Quarter, across an enormous block of the central Mississippi Valley, running from southeastern Missouri through western Kentucky and Tennessee, and out into the Arkansas River basin. The archaeological record shows a near total absence of settlement after roughly 1450. Not a reduced population, not smaller towns. An emptied region the size of a mid-sized European country. This matters independently of anything found at Spiro, because it was not built from Spiro. It comes from summed radiocarbon distributions and ceramic sequences compiled across dozens of unrelated sites by researchers who were not trying to explain Craig Mound, and in most cases had no interest in it. The sequence is regional. Cahokia, the largest city north of Mexico, in the American bottom near present-day Collinsville, Illinois, is effectively gone by somewhere between 1350 and 1400. Spiro closes around 1450. The lights go out across the middle of the continent in a rolling wave. And then there's the timing against European contact. The expedition of Hernando de Soto crossed the Mississippi River in the 1540s, and its chroniclers described densely populated provinces in some areas. In others, they moved through country that later archaeology has confirmed had already been abandoned for generations. The emptying begins before the Europeans arrive. Whatever happened at Spiro, epidemic disease introduced from Europe cannot be the cause. The dates do not permit it. If it was not sickness, and it was not conquest, the next place to look is not in the ground at all. It is in the wood. Tree ring dating measures annual growth rings in timber, and because rings vary in width with rainfall and temperature, a long enough sequence becomes a year-by-year record of climate. The bald cypress and post-oak chronologies of the Mississippi and Arkansas drainages, developed through the long-running dendrochronology program associated with David Stahl at the University of Arkansas, extend well back past the 15th century. Those chronologies record sustained. severe drought episodes striking precisely the maize-dependent floodplain economies that supported the Mississippian cities. Then, there is the geological layer sitting on top of it. Ice cores drilled in Greenland and Antarctica preserve annual layers of snowfall, and within those layers, sulfate spikes mark the fallout from major volcanic eruptions. One of the largest sulfate signals of the last 1,000 years appears in the mid-1450s, generally attributed to the eruption of Kuwait in the South Pacific, and it is corroborated by cold summer signatures and tree rings across the northern hemisphere. A climate downturn with a physical marker frozen into ice at both poles. Here is what makes that hard to dismiss. This is not archaeologists dating archaeology. Tree rings are annual and absolutely dated. There is no calibration curve, no laboratory judgment call, no error range of a century in either direction. You count the rings. The climate record and the abandonment record were assembled by separate disciplines, using methods that have nothing in common, and they land on the same 50 years. If this is the kind of story you want more of, sites that were written off as looted, or amateur, or unpublishable, and turned out to be the most important evidence anyone had subscribing, is how you get them. New one every week, and each one names the researcher, the dating method, and the number. Which brings us to the third line of evidence, and to the man who preserved it while being told for most of his life that he was not qualified to. His name was Henry W. Hamilton. He lived in Marshall, Missouri, and he was an avocational archaeologist, a working man with no university appointment, no departmental affiliation, and no institutional funding. In the mid-1930s, while the professional field was still deciding whether Spiro was worth its attention, Hamilton understood exactly what was being hauled out of Craig Mound and sold across 3 states. So he went after it. He tracked the objects into the hands of dealers and collectors. He photographed them. He recorded which piece had gone to which buyer and when. He interviewed the men who had done the digging and wrote down what they described seeing inside the chamber before it was emptied. He was, in effect, running a salvage operation on the only thing that could still be saved, which was the information. American archaeology in the 1930s and 40s drew a hard line between credentialed excavation and everything else. And Hamilton was on the wrong side of that line. His work was categorized as collecting rather than scholarship. The Spiro material itself was widely regarded as scientifically dead. The provenience was gone. And without provenience, the reasoning went, an object is a curiosity rather than evidence. Hamilton published his compilation in the Missouri Archaeologist in 1952. For years, it was treated as a hobbyist catalog. Then someone looked again. When James A. Brown of Northwestern University set out decades later to reconstruct the Great Mortuary, the problem he faced was that the deposit existed only as fragments scattered across dozens of museums and an unknown number of private holdings. Reassembling it required knowing which object had come from where, and in what association. That information survived in exactly one place. It survived in the notes of a man the profession had declined to take seriously. Brown's reconstruction of Spiro, which is now the standard interpretation of the site, and the basis for its recognition as one of the most significant ceremonial centers in North America, rests in substantial part on Hamilton's records. The material toured national museums in a major exhibition in the 2020s. The vindication is real. And it should also be stated honestly, the objects were still sold, still scattered, still separated from one another permanently. Hamilton preserved the map of something that had already been broken. Now the part of this that has to be said plainly, because the mainstream explanation for Spiro is not foolish and it is not a cover-up. It is the most reasonable reading of the available evidence, and it deserves to be stated at full strength. In that reading, Spiro was a regional ceremonial center at the western frontier of the Mississippian world, never a city on the scale of Cahokia, and its elite maintained their position through long-distance exchange and exotic goods. When sustained drought degraded maize yields across the mid-continent, the agricultural surplus that funded that elite disappeared with it. People then did the rational thing that people do. They dispersed to smaller, more resilient settlements, took their families and their traditions with them, and their descendants are the Caddo and Wichita nations, who are here now, and who never vanished at all. Under this view, the Great Mortuary is simply a well-appointed mortuary facility, and the hollow chamber is a structural accident of collapsed cedar timber, rather than a sealed vault. The specific objections are precise and fair. The context of the deposit was destroyed in 1935, and everything about its internal arrangement is reconstruction built partly on the testimony of looters. Radiocarbon on a cedar pole dates the tree, not the event, and old wood effects can push a date earlier than the moment of construction by decades. Stylistic dating of heirloom objects is interpretive rather than absolute, and specialists disagree about how tight those sequences really are. And the word vanished is a framing imposed from outside, a term applied by people who were not there to a migration that the descendant communities have never described as a disappearance. Every one of those objections is legitimate. Every one of them has to be answered before anyone claims something unusual happened at Spiro. Here is the detail that the standard explanation cannot account for. Gradual economic decline does not produce a single event deposit. A society drifting apart under drought pressure does not gather 3 centuries of accumulated sacred objects, sourced from 4 separate regions, hundreds of miles apart in 4 different directions, sort them by category, place them together inside a cedar structure, close it, and never return to it. Decline leaves a thinning record. It leaves smaller houses, poorer burials, fewer imports, a slow tapering of activity across decades. It does not leave a curated collection, sealed in a single act at the exact moment the region empties. That is not a collapse signature. That is a closing ceremony, and it was scheduled. Set the 3 lines of evidence beside one another, and the shape of it comes clear. The first line is regional archaeology. Across the Arkansas and central Mississippi valleys, from southeastern Missouri to western Tennessee to eastern Oklahoma, occupation ends within roughly a century, and it ends before Europeans reach the interior. That is measured in radiocarbon and ceramic sequences at dozens of sites by researchers with no shared agenda. The second line is climate, recorded in 2 independent physical archives. Tree rings from the bald cypress and post-oak chronologies of the Arkansas and Mississippi drainages record sustained agricultural drought-striking maize-dependent floodplain economies. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica record a major volcanic sulfate spike in the mid-1450s, matched by cold summer signatures in northern hemisphere tree rings. Annual resolution. No interpretation required. The third line is the deposit itself, inside Craig Mound, at the western edge of that emptying region. Someone assembled the accumulated ceremonial objects of 2.5 centuries and sealed them in a chamber at precisely the moment the valley depopulated. Those 3 lines do not merely sit alongside each other. They explain each other. Climate removed the agricultural surplus. The surplus was what the long-distance exchange network and the ceremonial order ran on. And rather than that order dissolving quietly into the ground the way collapse usually looks, the people at Spiro appear to have performed an ending. They retired the objects of a world that was no longer viable, put them somewhere permanent, and walked out of the Arkansas River Valley. That is the correction to the timeline. Not a mysterious disappearance, a dated, deliberate closure, carried out by people who knew what they were doing and why. And the framing has to be rejected explicitly. They did not vanish. The Caddo Nation of Oklahoma and the Wichita and affiliated tribes are their descendants, and they are the reason much of what those objects meant is understood at all. What ended at Spiro was a city and a system, It was not a people. There is one more thing to say about Craig Mound, and it is the part that has never been resolved. The contents of the Great Mortuary are scattered across dozens of institutions in the United States and an unknown number of private collections. A significant portion has never been cataloged, never been photographed by a professional, and never been published. Objects sold out of that pasture in 1935 to buyers who left no records are still, right now, in private hands somewhere in this country. They cannot be studied. They cannot be dated. They cannot be returned. Nobody knows how many there are, because the only person counting was Henry Hamilton, and he could only count what he was able to find. The ground itself is only partially excavated. The Oklahoma Historical Society manages roughly 150 acres at Spiro Mounds, and only a fraction of that has ever been dug. The surrounding floodplain contains associated residential areas that have never been systematically investigated. The reason it has not been resolved is straightforward. Craig Mound's original stratigraphy was destroyed with explosives in November of 1935 and cannot be recovered by any method. Human remains from the site fall under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act and have been returned to descendant nations, which means the ancient DNA work that has rewritten the story of other regions is not available here and should not be. Any further excavation proceeds only with tribal consent, and there is no funded program to carry one out. The unexcavated ground at Spiro is still there, under grass, 90 years after the tunnel. The objects that came out of that chamber have never all been counted.